In the mid-1990s, British developer Rare was starting development on the Nintendo 64 titles. To overly simplify the history, the team behind Killer Instinct wanted to make a 3D platformer to follow the success of Super Mario 64. So they decided to go for a cute squirrel because it would appeal to a wide demographic. This red squirrel, Conker, was set to debut in Conker's Quest, and its overly cute design was drawing some ire from games journalists at E3 1997 who wanted something a little less childish. It wasn't helped that it was announced the same time as Banjo Kazooie, which shifted development at Rare directly because of Conker's Quest. Journalists saw two cutesy Nintendo 64 3D platformers starring bipedal animals, and they weren't particularly impressed by either, but even then they still preferred Banjo Kazooie. Neither game saw a release that year despite initial plans. Instead, they both debuted as Diddy Kong's friends in the best Nintendo 64 kart racer, and no, this isn't up for debate. Conker was one of the many wonderful cutesy characters fans fell in love with. And he's actually decent, unlike my childhood favourite Crunch, who is the worst character in any kart racing game. 1998 saw updates to these two Rare platforming stars battling for attention. Conker's Quest was renamed to 12 Tales Conker 64, and Banjo Kazooie was actually released and became a massive hit, once so big and influential that every YouTuber in the early 2010s had to say it was their childhood favourite, or else it'd be ostracised. The 1998 coverage of 12 Tales was more upbeat. Particular focus was on the visuals, which were super impressive at the time. The new release date of autumn 1998 wasn't met either, because as was the case with Conker games, this just had to keep getting delayed. So much so that this game first shown off in E3 1997 wasn't released until 2001, with another name change being Conker's Bad Fur Day. And this took the characters and world in a very different direction, and the multiple Conker successes that you've never heard of also follow Bad Fur Day's precedent. So it makes Conker's first appearance in Diddy Kong Racing look like an outlier, but during the dragged out development of Conker's Quest, Rare's handheld team started working on a side game for the Game Boy. It was 1997, and since the first console game was surely releasing soon, this would make a great side dish. But the problem was that while this Game Boy game was developed quickly, as you'd expect, they couldn't release a side game to one that wasn't actually out, so they just sat on it and waited. Enough time passed that the original Game Boy wasn't relevant anymore, so they made the game again for Game Boy Color. Eventually, Rare realized that 12 Tales Conker 64 wasn't going to release anytime soon. So in June 1999, this smaller handheld iteration of a console game released, without said console game coming out. Conker's Pocket Tales was all the franchise was for years, its name being an especially odd one since this isn't Pocket Tales, these were his only tales. As such, this continued with the cutesy theme that Conker was shown to have before Bad Fur Day hit the scene, and the weird Game Boy and Game Boy Color release that this is made this a game unlike any other. This isn't a Game Boy game that gets added color when put in the newest system. Instead, this black cartridge contains both the Game Boy game and the Game Boy Color game on the same card, and it loads whichever one is relevant to whichever system. So on early Game Boy models and the Super Game Boy for SNES, you get the original game, and on Game Boy Color and Advance and the Game Boy Player for GameCube, you get the remade game. In addition to different graphics, these games also have different map layouts, controls, save systems, and a bunch of other things that add up. I saw it described once as it's like having Donkey Kong Country 2 and Donkey Kong Land 2 on the same cartridge, just in this case with much less of a graphical leap. But these two games might look identical to an outsider, but they're deceptively different games, despite many shared elements. Plus it has the most significant difference. The Game Boy Color game was the first game to have the Rare cowl. Unfortunately, it's not in the monochrome release. For the uninitiated, the Rare cow was an Easter egg in some of the Game Boy Color and Advance games Rare made. Conker started this legacy, and it's the best thing about Pocket Tales. Oh, that doesn't sound promising. Pocket Tales is 2 games, and one of them I'd call charming and almost enjoyable, and the other I'd call charming and a little enjoyable. But even when I complain, you need to remember the infectious hold this game has on people. It's not uncommon to play it and talk to the other 10 people who have played it, and compare your favourite lines of dialogue or the weird characters you like the most. For me, it's this segment and my pal Dusty. This is one of those games that you'll eventually say you didn't like, but boy do you have a soft spot for it. It's odd and charming. It has a talking acorn called Ted the Boat Builder. What more do you need? This adventure starts off on Conker's birthday. He and Barry are celebrating, but then evil Acorn shows up and kidnaps Barry, as well as scattering all of Conker's presents on the map. It's now up to our little squirrel to save Barry and get his presents back. Though if you play the original version, the game actually opens up to Conker's horrifying face, and I love it. Unfortunately, this isn't on Game Boy Color, but the Super Game Boy made sure to not disappoint here. Immediately after the story's set up, we get a good feel for Conker's movement, and it's alright, though it's not ideal. Because of the limited buttons here, we double tap the D-pad to run. You get used to it, but it's not ideal. If they were to remake this game on a system with more input methods, it would benefit a lot from it. Just don't hold your breath for that. Other than movement, he has a jump that does its job, and an attack that is useless at first but is shortly upgraded into a slingshot, which is a good projectile attack. And he has minor other things like a ground pound, and he can dig in specific dirt patches to travel to other specific dirt patches. The slingshot here actually requires ammo, which is a remnant of early builds of Conker on the Nintendo 64. And it's fine here. Ammo is everywhere, so you shouldn't run out, but it does mean you have to put a little thought into when to fire the slingshot. He isn't bringing a lot to the table, so it's good that his jump and slingshot work as well as they do. It's simple, but hey, they're the glue that holds this game together, since it's most of what you actually do. People have said this is basically like a Zelda game, and there is some truth in it, though with a lot less variety of puzzles and main obstacles. But we have a lot of forced mini-games here, and they are almost all anywhere between dreadful and okay. Though the ones based around target shooting are fun enough, especially this one on Mako Island or Game Boy Color, which edges out the monochrome version with 2 different crosshairs. But to get back to the start, Willow Wood serves as our hub world, and it's nice, although it's easy to get lost in until you know your way around. It helps to read the signs and to talk to the friendly acorns. Willow Woods also serves as our introductory chapter. The game's locales are all very segmented off, and on a casual run, not based on 100%ing it, you never need to go back to a single world. So it makes each locale feel like a chapter on your way to the end goal of rescuing Barry. These woods where Conker lives have your first handful of presents, and it ends with our first boss fight, Histamine. I love his design, and especially his name, though the fight itself is pretty basic and not that exciting. Though on GBC he does speed up after being hit, which is a nice extra challenge, and a good way to convey that you're actually hurting him. But really, Histamine is just here to show how awesome evil Acorn is. Next it's on to the actual exciting home world of the rare cow, Vultureville. This is one of the highlights of the game, even though it's mostly flat and boring. But that's cause we have a whole acorn town with lots of memorable characters like the Undertaker, who dies right in front of us, or Sheriff, who arrests us for murdering the Undertaker, and the rest of the acorns too, I suppose. On GBC, all these buildings are labelled, which is a huge bonus for players who haven't memorised the entirety of Vultureville. Vultureville also highlights the absurdity of one of the main puzzles here. Very often throughout the game, we have to press buttons on the floor in the right order to open a door, and here it's how we escape from jail after murder. Though it's okay, once we leave the jail, Sheriff says that he knows we're innocent, because this was all done by the game's secondary antagonist, Conker the Skunk. He's always here to cause minor trouble like disturbing the peace or murder, but he's second fiddle to evil Acorn who ruined Conker's birthday and kidnapped his friend. Vultureville itself is a nice flat area, but after leaving the town itself, we get more geographical variety. Though the colour version trims this down a lot for a simpler layout that is more welcoming, but I'm sure hardcore Pocket Tales fans would demand for more rigorous terrain. Regardless of the layout, we meet the Acorns based on bad Native American stereotypes, then we learn how to swim, and then we move on to the combined boss fight Sol and Luxo. Swimming itself is interesting as it takes on the side-on perspective, which probably helped the many comparisons this game already had to Link's Awakening. It's a nice mechanic that at its best adds nice variety, though the treatment of the boss fight is another area that the color version comes out on top. With the original version having them stay idle on the ground for the first few seconds, it makes it pretty disappointing. After that, we get Crow Keep, which shines much more strongly on Game Boy Color. Crow Keep is our medieval fantasy world, and it's almost entirely set indoors, and how this works is really different between these two games. In the original, each room of an interior location is a fixed grid, where it transitions to the next room once you're about to cross the threshold. It works really similarly to top-down Zelda games. Though the Game Boy Color version doesn't do this, and it just smoothly follows Conker all the time. In some ways, the original sounds superior. It means each room is properly delineated, and everything is in the player's view. Nothing in the room is off-screen regardless of Conker's location, and we don't get the weird half and half of being in rooms like we do in the GBC. But those are exactly why the Game Boy Color version is much more welcoming. Because on the original, you can cross screens and walk right into an enemy you didn't know would be there. Or you can hug the side of a screen and be prevented from crossing over there because there's an object on the other screen that you wouldn't know would be there. It basically leads to a lot of cheap shots and invisible walls in the original. And while on the topic of praising one version and belittling the other, the visuals here are really different, and I don't just mean the colour, that's obvious. But Crow Keep is when we really start to notice all the extra decorations and visual flair that GBC added. But to get back onto gameplay, this world is filled with lots of spikes and other hazards that want Conker dead, as well as just having lots of enemies in general. It's rough at times, which is why the more fluid GBC version made this a more fun challenge than an infuriating one. Crow Keep on Game Boy Color ranks highly in my list of worlds across both these games, but for the Game Boy version, it is one I dread more than almost any other. I know dissing the original will make me lose my DK Vine cred, and I'm sorry, there are things I like there too. In fact, the boss fight here is my favourite across both games, and they're just fun regardless of whichever version you play. It's a fight against this wizard named Waldorf, and he fires attacks which you have to dodge while you slingshot him to death. The maneuvering of these projectiles and finding the right time to get mine in made this a fight unlike any other. It actually reminded me of Final Fantasy Adventure, which is one of my favourite games for the Game Boy. Though to praise the GBC a little, this version is slightly more fun because he speeds up every time he's hurt, much like Histamine before him. After this, we get a choice of two worlds, and to avoid being mean, I'll start with Claw Swamp. Now both versions of this are really different, more so than any other map differences, and I love both of these about as equally as each other. This is an exterior location, so the Game Boy doesn't suffer like it did with Crow Keep. This spike-laden and obstacle-filled stage never runs into any issues. This just makes full use of the solid platforming, and the only other diversions here are block-moving puzzles, which are my favourite of the recurring gameplay shifts. It's just pushing blocks onto certain spaces, and since pushes go as far as they can in any direction, it makes these a neat puzzle. It is let down by most of them being really boring and easy, but I suppose this kid's game about a talking squirrel's birthday party is allowed to be a little easy. Surprisingly, the layouts of these puzzles are really different on Game Boy Color, and in some cases much harder, but there are also some that are just much worse. You know, you win some, you lose some. Both versions of the swamp are great, though my biased heart actually goes in favour of the monochrome version, because it has armadillos that look like the armies from Donkey Kong games. And it makes sense since this game is happy to show its DK Land pedigree, since if you leave Conker idle for a while, he pulls out his Game Boy and plays it, a trend that would continue with the eventual Conker console game, where instead he pulled out his Game Boy for Killer Instinct. And also the Game Boy Color version of this map has more water and mud everywhere, which definitely helps it feel more like a swamp and, well, a real life location. But I'm a simple person, and I prefer the jumping over the OG spikes more. Before I wrap up this zone, we have a boss here called Swamp Fiend, and it's alright. That's all. In my initial playthrough, I was naive and hadn't yet experienced Mucko Island, so I was so pleased with this swamp and thought maybe the game was finally clicking, but my enthusiasm didn't last long. Mucko Island is suffering. Don't let the tropical locale fool you. This area looks nice, and it even has a shark, so I can't hate it. But everything here is the worst. Okay, well, maybe not everything. Ted the boat builder, he's here and I love him. He builds boats, and he's called Ted. All the worlds have had different gameplay feels behind them, and that's been a pro of this game. We've traded in the platforming focus for a return to Vultureville's collecting of items in a smooth land not infested with spikes. Though now we even have swimming, which is some nice variety that I enjoy. The difference that makes this the worst world in the game is this has challenges that are dreadful. Though the shooting one is fun, but the rest are like Mario Party minigames designed in hell. Mash your D-pad with more force than you can muster, anything less than that isn't good enough. For what it's worth, the Game Boy Color version did change these up slightly, but not slightly enough, and it's still miserable. But once you repeatedly prove your superiority to Conker the skunk, you get to race in a boat, win, or evil Acorn kills Berry, though I won't commit to that here. The race is okay, though it is more enjoyable in the Game Boy Color, since it trims the 2 laps down to 1. And also Mucko Island is just more enjoyable on the Color, because Ted's boat building workshop is properly labelled. Thankfully we get to wash away the taste of that world with a strangely named Aztec temple. Name notwithstanding, this is a nice penultimate locale. It's a return to the Crow Keep style, which is a godsend after Mucko, and on Game Boy Color, it inherits all the benefits Crow Keep did on the newer system. Plus, exclusive to Game Boy Color, we get a whole bunch of swimming areas in this temple, which really elevates this to a wholly unique area, instead of feeling like Crow Keep Part 2. Oh, and we have another boss fight here after skipping Mucko Island, and it's probably the most interesting one in the game mechanically. The game kinda built up to a decent conclusion here, so it's time for the game to throw that away in favour of the real final world, some boring looking caves. However, it is made more interesting with evil Acorn kidnapping a bunch of other acorns and holding them captive here. You have to find them and Berry, and be quick because we get an epic escape sequence here as evil Acorn sets off a bomb to destroy this cave and kill everyone he's holding captive. It's about equally as fine in both versions, though on the Color version we get much more visual flair with the screen shaking, and more importantly a timer counting down how long we have left, though I still do kind of love Berry's interruptions on the original version. After this we get a nice ending, including evil Acorn being launched into space, and the best credit sequence ever. Well, that's on GBC, the original had boring credits. I don't get why so many people prefer the original version. This poll is rigged, I tell ya. How can people deny the glory of all these different trees here in the enhanced version? Look, I know at best these games are just okay, and at their worst they're not good at all, but I really do have a soft spot for him. It has friendly acorns with fun names, and an evil acorn called Evil Acorn, and the tone is all over the place, including silly moments and death. But more importantly, it's a tangible view of a series that never really got to exist. Like sure, the Conker series does exist and it got a few games, but none of them star the cute, happy, childlike version people were first introduced to, except for this game. Also, it's just a nice farewell to an era of Rare. This was the last game they made for the original Game Boy, even if most people don't acknowledge that, since it's only branded as a Game Boy Color game. And that's all people know it as, except for us weirdos and the subculture of Acorn lovers. And I believe this was the last Rare game to have dedicated save spots. Originally, you can only save your game at these specific locations that make me think of Shrek, whereas its own Game Boy Color version allowed you to save anywhere. It's such a weird footnote, but I love this game. I just don't love playing it. And Conker isn't the only birthday boy, because next video I'm looking at Time Hollow, a Nintendo DS adventure game about Ethan Kairos, around the time of his 17th birthday. He'll get into all sorts of drama as he discovers his own method of manipulating the past to change the present.